Thanks everybody for joining in. My name is Jeff Abramson. I help manage the forum on the arms trade. We're going to wait a minute or two in order to get started. But thanks for joining in. You may be able to see the chat in the Q&A. We'll start shortly. Okay, hi. My name is Jeff Abramson. I'm director of the Forum on the Arms Trade, which is a network of about 180 experts and emerging experts around the world who work on arms trade, security assistance, and weapons use issues. Really delighted you could join in for this webinar today. This is the fourth in a series that's being led by the Emerging Expert Program under the leadership of Mona Lisa, who has a small arms and light weapons working group. This is the third and one in a row, one a month of different conversations related to small arms and light weapons. And I'm going to turn it over to Mona Lisa now to get us going. Thanks.
Thanks, Jeff. Greetings, everyone. My name is Monalisa Hazarika, and it is my privilege to moderate today's webinar on challenges and opportunities in firearms marking and record keeping. Like Jeff said, this event is organized by the Small Arms and Light Weapons Working Group of the Emerging Experts Program of the Forum, and is the fourth in the series of events we will be hosting in the coming months. For those of you who are new to the Forum, the Emerging Experts Program is a training and networking initiative for a cohort of early career professionals who have expressed an interest in addressing the humanitarian, economic, and other implications of arms transfers, security assistance, and weapon use. So today, on behalf of the entire group, I would like to thank each of you for joining us for this timely discussion. Today's webinar will explore the critical link between firearms marking and record keeping and their role in stockpile management, diversion, prevention, and traceability. Panelists will examine how gaps in national systems, such as weak inventory control, fragmented databases, and challenges in digitization, limit the ability of authorities to trace firearms use in crime and disrupt trafficking networks. By integrating policy perspectives with practical experiences, the discussion aims to highlight how stronger integrated marking and record keeping systems can enhance accountability, support criminal investigations, and improve international cooperation in line with the UN Programme of Action, the International Tracing Instrument, the Firearms Protocol, and other regional instruments. Further, it seeks to identify actionable practices, highlight policy and capacity gaps, and foster dialogue among a wide range of actors. We are honored to have with us a distinguished panel of experts who bring a wealth of knowledge and experience to this critical discussion. Joining us today are Ashley Hamer, Callum Lloyd, Natalia Polacchi, and Silvia De Pedro. Ashley Hamer is a senior investigator with Conflict Armament Research, an independent organization that generates evidence on the global diversion of weapons, ammunition, and associated technologies. Ms. Hamer has worked on CAR's West Africa and Sahel team for the past 8 years, where she investigates weapons diversion largely in support of counterterrorism and counter transnational organized crime efforts. Callum is the senior project and research coordinator at Arquebus Europe. He holds an MSc in development and security with distinction from the University of Bristol. He provides consultancy, training, and research services regarding small arms and light weapons control. And his previous experiences includes EU-funded project Focal SF to assess the implementation of national firearms focal points in Europe. Callum was also Arquebus lead for EU-funded project RegiSync, which aimed to harmonize the legal arms transfers of 35 jurisdictions by promoting good practices and common standards to strengthen the regular exchange of information among LEAs and registry officials. Natalia Polacchi is the project director of the Brazilian NGO Instituto Sou da Paz. She has worked on arms control since 2013, focusing mainly on small arms and ammunition, studying their life cycle, origins, and effects on public security, including their differential impact. Her work includes research, pilot projects in coordination with police departments, and advocacy. She was listed twice in the publication Forces of Change by UNLIREC and integrates a few advisory committees. She holds a master's degree in international relations from USP. Then we have Sylvia De Pedro, who is a project advisor at OnlyRec with over 7 years of experience supporting states and international organizations on preventing and countering illicit firearms trafficking, especially across Latin America and the Caribbean. She has led a project on arms control in Haiti, having previously served as UNODC's firearms focal point for the Caribbean. In 2025, she coordinated a research project on the limitation and opportunities of laser engravings for firearms marking, together with two ballistic experts, Ruben Arencibia and Philip Boyce, and she consolidated the findings in the paper that she will be presenting today. Now, before I pass the floor to our speakers, I wanted to inform and encourage you to please use the chat function to communicate your thoughts and ideas with your fellow participants, of course, keeping it respectful and professional, and the Q&A feature to submit your questions to our panelists, which we will be taking on after their presentations. I will be monitoring the Q&A function, so if you have any question at any stage of today's webinar, please submit them there. And with that, I would now like to turn it over to Ashley for the first presentation. Please, the floor is yours.
Hello, everybody. Good day. Mona Lisa, thank you so much for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be part of the panel today. As you mentioned, my name is Ashley Hamer. I'm a senior field investigator for conflict armament research. Hopefully you can all hear me okay. I work on our West Africa team and have done so for the past 8 years. For those who are unfamiliar, as there may be a few, Conflict Armament Research is an independent organization that generates evidence on the global diversion of weapons, ammunition, and associated technologies. We do this through on-the-ground documentation of seized or recovered material, supply chain investigations, and tracing. CAR is mainly concerned with understanding the illicit circulation of weapons and preventing weapon diversion. We are directed to trace the recovered material that we encounter in the field to identify points of diversion, and our organization exists to inform and support effective weapon management and control. In West Africa, we work with national authorities, often counter-terrorism and counter-transnational organized crime units, as well as the judiciary, to support their investigations and improve evidence management. As a field investigator, I come at the topics of firearms marking and record keeping from the point at which the weapon has already been diverted into illicit circulation and recovered by security forces, often in a counter-terrorism related incident or a terrorism related incident. And I am tasked to identify the weapon, reconstruct its legal chain of custody, and trace its point of diversion. To identify and trace a seized firearm, we need to accurately record and interpret its unique identifying markings, including the serial number, post-production marks, any import markings or state marking initiative codes that are present on the weapon. Effective record keeping is a prerequisite for tracing weapons that have been diverted. Marking the weapon is redundant if those marks are not retained in accurate record keeping systems
Sorry.
throughout the transfer.
I'm so sorry, Ashley. If you're sharing your slides, we can't see them.
Oh, sorry, I haven't started yet. I will.
Oh, I'm so sorry. Please continue.
Don't worry, sorry, that wasn't clear. They're coming up in just a minute. So back to West Africa. West African states, impressively, were some of the earliest adopters of the Arms Trade Treaty, and the implementation of firearms marking has been a high priority in the region, largely governed by the ECOWAS Convention on Small Arms and Light Weapons of 2006. Article 18 of the ECOWAS Convention obligates all member states to mark their firearms and maintain electronic databases. A significant complication has arisen, however, since the coups that occurred in Burkina Faso, Mali, and Niger in 2020 to 2023, with these states' subsequent announced withdrawal from ECOWAS completely, and so far no indication as to whether they plan to really continue complying with any ECOWAS provisions. As you're no doubt aware, the expanding terrorism threat in West Africa has spread from these three countries, and they each experience huge problems with illicit circulation of weapons, and in particular, weapons diversion from state stockpiles. Now I will jump in to just share my slides. Hopefully, I can do this quickly.
That looks
Can
good.
you?
Thanks,
That
Ashley.
looks good. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Um, oh, hang on. Oh, now here's a challenge. Oh, okay. I need to just. Okay, so that's you can see the slides. You can see the little boxes highlighting the markings. Is that right?
That's right.
Okay, perfect. So I've got a couple of examples here, just simple examples of ECOWAS marking codes, West Africa's standard marking codes on a couple of seized weapons. These are weapons seized in illicit circumstances in a couple of different countries in West Africa and documented by our investigators. What you can see there are you've got the ECOWAS logo visible. You've got the ISO code for the custodian country, ML for Mali, BF for Burkina Faso. You've got the custodian identified, FAMA, the Armed Forces of Mali, PN, the police, the National Police of Burkina Faso, and you've got the weapon's original serial number repeated in the ECOWAS marking code. We therefore know at the point we see these weapons that each weapon was in the legal custody of a certain state at the point of its marking. Now, despite high levels of political will among West African states, numerous challenges to implementation of marking and record keeping obligations remain. These include many long and porous and insecure borders and a rapidly evolving and deteriorating political and security environment with the circulation of illicit and unmarked weapons. There's a lack of resources and technical capacity, obtaining and maintaining expensive marking equipment, and a centralization process for marking weapons, or having mobile teams moving around the territory and training personnel to conduct and maintain equipment. There's a record-keeping challenge which concerns in particular manufacturers and intermediaries at their stage. It's inconsistency in the minimum floor set by international instruments for record keeping. And the minimum requirements don't allow for effective tracing of many of the weapons that we see, that we encounter, which, although they're in perfect working order and recovered, say, from terrorist groups, they predate the international tracing instrument's 20-year record retention period. This shows the importance of digital record keeping as we now have the capacity, entities have the capacity to keep records indefinitely. West African states are required to trace, and many have appointed, or ECOWAS members are required to trace, and many have appointed national tracing focal points, but there is minimal domestic sensitization about the process, therefore minimal engagement, say, with Interpol or with our own tracing operation. People simply don't know the process and they don't know how to go about it. And with regards to feeding Interpol's IARMS database with either lost or stolen or missing weapons data, West African states have actually reported very little information, which means that when they then go to attempt to trace or cross-compare with IARMS, they find very little information that's relevant to them. I have two quick examples drawn from our fieldwork, which illustrates how we seek a weapon's unique markings and use these to guide and support certain investigations. You have on the screen here a Serbian manufactured assault rifle. It's bearing the ECOWAS marking code marked in accordance with the convention standards, and it identifies the Burkina Faso National Police as the intended custodian at the time of marking. The weapon was seized from suspected terrorists in northern Benin in 2024. CARD documented the weapon in Benin last year, 2025. Judicial investigations often have to move quite fast. For instance, if you have suspects in custody, and formal weapon tracing processes can be very time consuming. For a start, there's a requirement to allow a 28-day response time to an issued trace request. Via informal tracing cooperation, regional cooperation channels between neighbors, investigators can request their counterparts in a neighboring jurisdiction examine their records, of course, if these exist. In this particular case, the Burkinabe authorities were consulted and were able to identify this rifle in their records and determine that it was seized in a terrorist ambush in 2023 in eastern Burkina Faso. Facilitation of information sharing between Benin and Burkina Faso authorities benefited both investigations and shows the clear value of detailed weapon markings and the accurate accessible records. And it also indicates a potential case of terrorist groups moving across borders to be further investigated by the authorities. This second example shows the importance of marking, including the manufacturer's marking of internal transferable components. We know that certain firearms components can be changed, can be interchanged. It's something we see regularly with assault rifle models across Africa. Following a major terrorist attack in Ouagadougou of Burkina Faso on the 2nd of March 2018, several weapons were seized, including a Russian AKM assault rifle bearing the serial number that you see on the left, ending 3399. Documentation of that rifle by CAR revealed that some of its internal components came from different rifles. Then 2 months later, Burkina Faso security forces led a counterterrorism operation in a neighborhood of Ouagadougou that neutralized another terrorist cell and also seized several weapons, including an AKMS assault rifle made by a different Russian factory and bearing the serial number 943850. Now, during the documentation of that event, we observed that that rifle ending 850 contained components marked with the serial number ending 3399, and therefore most likely originating in the rifle seized in the earlier attack. It wouldn't have been possible to cross-reference these two weapons from two different seizures, different events, without the components being marked, and then the systematic recording and storage of relevant data. It was therefore possible to develop a hypothesis that the two terrorist cells, the one that perpetrated the attack and the one that was neutralized in the later CTOP, were connected, and those rifles had likely passed through a common transit point because the components had been interchanged. Finally, perhaps I can just exit out of the screen share and go back to myself. Ooh, or is that too complicated? Stop sharing, back to myself.
That works.
Okay, just briefly, we are seeing some good practices in action in the region, despite many challenges. And us as an organization, we're available to support states to meet their obligations, especially with the recent adoption of the global framework on ammunition, which concerns improving ammunition traceability. States are increasingly aware that they can and should request appropriate marking from manufacturers at the point of procurement. We're seeing some standardizing and harmonizing of record keeping procedures and maintaining consistency and regularity of records input, establishing domestic SOPs, standard operating procedures that guide personnel and connect internal procedures to the regional and international arms control frameworks. Notably, Burkina Faso established these formal legal SOPs, legally binding SOPs, in 2019, which was a huge step forward. And finally, our organization has facilitated informal working groups to bring together small workshops of relevant practitioners and to encourage experience sharing in a more friendly and discreet setting. And we have found this to be an effective way to foster trust between counterparts from different jurisdictions and enable them to build their networks and hopefully lead to improved information sharing on certain investigations. With that, I will conclude and hand over, and I look forward to the discussion afterwards. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ashley, for your presentation. I think I found the example of ECOWAS marking codes from the weapons your team found that at BINA to be very interesting, especially the timeline for these investigations. Thank you also for sharing the good practices that you're seeing both globally and in the region. I would now like to move on to the second speaker of the day, Callum, who will be sharing insights from Europe. I request all the panelists to please keep their intervention under 10 minutes so that we have maximum time for reflection, discussions, and Q&A from the audience. Callum, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mona Lisa. So I'll keep my video off just as I appreciate I'm sharing a presentation here. If just give me a moment, I will get that up into view. Is that on screen now?
Yep, that's
Yes.
good. Thanks.
Great, thanks, Jeff. So, good morning and good afternoon, everyone. My name is Callum Lloyd, and I'm the Senior Project and Research Coordinator at Arquebus Europe. Just in this presentation, I'll briefly introduce Arquebus and our mission. I'll discuss lifecycle management, highlight some of the significant areas from our perspective. I'll then briefly outline some challenges that Arquebus has identified through our experience at a global level before then moving towards a European perspective, particularly focusing on Project RegiSync. I'll then briefly introduce an ongoing European research project called Vista, and then I'll finally just discuss some of the opportunities in lifecycle management, specifically the importance of the basics and the potential for lifecycle management systems to support fast time intelligence. So to begin with, Arquebus was established in 2012 by the founder and first director of the UK's National Ballistics Intelligence Service and is chaired by the first Director General of the UK's National Crime Agency, and we focus on small arms and light weapons control. We've worked extensively within global policing and intelligence environments worldwide, providing consulting, training and research capabilities, as well as forensic services and technology development. We also supported UNDP CSAC in the development and scoping and establishment of the Western Balkan firearms focal points, and we've participated in a number of EU-funded research projects. We also, interestingly for this particular session, support states across Africa, the Caribbean and Central America in the lifecycle management of state and civilian-held small arms and light weapons via our proprietary registration and licensing system, FireCycle. So I think to just touch briefly on lifecycle management, given some of the really pertinent interventions from our colleague at Conflict Armament Research, I'll assume that you understand the benefits of lifecycle management more generally. But I just wanted to highlight that the diagram on screen illustrates that the potential life cycles of small arms and light weapons. However, it's worth noting that in many jurisdictions worldwide, surplus or obsolete state-held weapons may be transferred into legal civilian ownership which should be appropriately marked as per Mosaic 05.3. Similarly, civilian weapons may be transferred into state possession and subsequent use, such as by seizure or battlefield capture. I'm sure that the colleague from CAR can certainly speak to this phenomenon more after the presentations. Um, Ideally, then, lifecycle management should include both legally held weapons, both by the civilians and the state, in addition to illicit weapons where possible, due to the ability for small arms and light weapons to pass back and forth between legal, illicit, state, and civilian circulation throughout the life cycle. So moving to some common record keeping challenges, I appreciate we're focusing on Europe for this presentation, but I'll just zoom out before then zooming back in on Europe, and just to inspire some discussion during the Q&A. It's important to note that the effective implementation of lifecycle management primarily depends on the context of the jurisdiction. Like, for example, a single central firearms registry might be appropriate for Lithuania, but not necessarily for Germany due to the latter's federal structure. Despite contextual differences, due to the transnational nature of illicit small arms and light weapons and the role that lifecycle management plays in tracing and tackling illicit trafficking, some level of standardization and harmonization between jurisdictions supports international information exchange and law enforcement cooperation. Understanding this, I've just listed a few common challenges under the categories of framework, data, personnel and resources, and technology, though it's crucial to note that some of these challenges are subnational, some of them are national, and some are more relevant at the international level. So to begin with framework, it's important to first discuss, well, what do we define as a firearm for record-keeping purposes? The Firearms Protocol's definition of firearm includes readily convertible objects, but for regulatory purposes, what actually constitutes a readily convertible object? And there's many different approaches to this issue. To tackle such issues, some European lifecycle management systems include blank firers and air guns in their lifecycle management systems, regardless of whether they are considered to be readily convertible or to be considered firearms. We also see issues around decentralized systems and how these can result in the fragmentation of records, which then hampers tracing. We often also see and encounter a conflation between licensing and registration in civilian lifecycle management. And in these instances, national civilian registries typically focus on licensing legal entities to possess firearms, and they don't necessarily record the full transaction history of the firearm as a result. In general, there are also limited levels of standardization and harmonization of data between jurisdictions, which can impact tracing and information exchange, for example, when referring to makes or models, or also synonymous calibers, where, for example, one caliber in one jurisdiction might be 6.75 Browning, but then in another it's 32 Auto. The EU is certainly a global leader in this respect, but there's still room for improvement. Moving to data, often there are partial records of the life cycle, for example, instances of firearms not being entered into the National Registry until firearms are sold by a registered firearms dealer. We also see instances of low quality data where the accuracy, precision, and completeness is lacking, and this hinders interagency cooperation at the subnational level, but then also international information exchange. Sometimes timeliness of data is an issue where the registry or registries are not updated regularly. And we also see issues with back capture and data migration, where historic physical or digital data that's costly and burdensome to transfer to new systems. We also see often issues with personnel and resources, and typically these relate to insufficient resourcing or training and insufficient funding. And that funding doesn't just go towards personnel, but also to technology. And regarding technology, we often see issues with paper-based systems. And although these are appropriate in many contexts, they're also liable to physical and environmental damage, are easier to tamper with, and lack security benefits offered by digital systems. They also tend to be more difficult to traipse through when tracing or investigating, as I'm sure the colleague from CAR can attest to. We also often see issues with legacy technology, particularly aged physical hardware and technology stacks that may have poor performance or pose cybersecurity risks. And often we also see unsustainable solutions where they might be digital and they might be effective, yet they're very cost prohibitive, or they require very specialized support, knowledge, or information technology, which isn't necessarily accessible to some jurisdictions. Finally, we also see in many instances ineffective solution design where there's no transaction-based logic to record the life cycle of weapons, there's limited or no search capability to query the system, there may be no data export or import capability, no application programming interface to facilitate links with other systems, or even in some instances, we've seen the ability to permanently delete data in the system without trace of that having occurred. I'll just quickly move to look at the European perspective. Project RegiSync studied the legal arms registers of 35 jurisdictions, including the member states, the Western Balkans, and Eastern European partners, and it established the state of play regarding civilian firearms registries in Europe. Crucially, the research found that some registries do not capture the full life cycle of legal ownership, only segments, and there were also differences in data format and syntax. Many registries also included licensing case management and were integrated with public application portals. We also saw numerous examples of good practice, however, and these included full centralized lifecycle management from import or manufacture through service to eventual destruction or export. We saw links between national registries and other digital systems, such as criminal records databases, import and export registries, health databases, etc. We also saw an example of GPS tracking of small arms and light weapons when in transit in a country with a very large manufacturing base. We also saw integrated reference tables to ensure clean data. However, multiple types of reference table were used across the EU. We also saw integration of passive and active ballistic test firing programs, where collected ballistic material was linked to registered firearms. Finally, we also saw the integration of dealers, manufacturers, and gunsmiths' inventories into the registry, in addition to license checks and sales being conducted through the registry by registered firearms dealers, ensuring that data is always timely and accurate. I'll just quickly move to Project Vista, which is looking at national seizure databases in Europe. It's an EU-funded research project to enhance the intelligence picture in the member states, the Western Balkans, Moldova, and Ukraine, focusing on capability building and targeted support. It's needed primarily due to a lack of standardized and harmonized firearms seizure data, both in Europe and globally. And it seeks to support the development and implementation of a European common minimum data set on firearms seizure data, and to establish the state of play on firearms seizure data, provide policy recommendations and guidance in accordance with Priority 2 of the EU Action Plan. I appreciate I'm coming up to my 10 minutes, so I'll just very quickly whiz through some of the opportunities. I think the key thing that I want everybody to take away today is that there are opportunities to integrate innovative marking technologies such as chemical taggants, ammunition marking, RFID, and GPS. There's also opportunity to integrate active or passive test firing of state and or civilian firearms. If the intelligence suggests misuse or diversion, this can help to improve deterrence and detection of misuse. However, the basics matter. And a lot of these basics aren't being done globally. And these are appropriate digitalization of lifecycle management, full lifecycle management, and developing a single source of truth for weapons within the jurisdiction, which does still not occur in many jurisdictions worldwide. Finally, a key thing is making sure that there's appropriate safeguards, accountability, and oversight of registry features. I've seen national registries that are an Excel spreadsheet that are available on somebody's phone, and we've seen examples such as the Christian Prinsloo case of registries systems that allow the destruction of firearms to be fraudulently recorded within the system. I'll just quickly move to the final opportunity. Now, at Arquebus, our background comes from national firearms focal points, and once these basics are in place, there's an opportunity for a lifecycle management system to support fast time intelligence. Fast time intelligence focuses on systematic gathering and evaluation of data and information through a defined process, turning it into strategic and operational analysis products, which serve as a basis for improved and informed decision making. The National Firearms Focal Point can act as a fast-time intelligence center for weapons, which integrates information from inside and outside the gun on a multi-agency basis to develop tactical and strategic intelligence. NFFPs have been seen to be extremely effective. For example, firearms crime in the UK dropped by over 50% during NABES's first 6 years of service, and the value of NFFPs were recently affirmed at the international level in the UN Programme of Action's fourth review conference outcome document. Crucially, lifecycle management registries are a core data source for firearms focal points, being referenced in both the EFE's best practice guidelines on NFFPs, UNDP CSAC's guidelines on national firearms focal points, and the European Council conclusions. Lifecycle management systems are therefore not just crucial for weapons and ammunition management for tracing, but they're also very important towards proactive, fast time intelligence that builds upstream preventative activity. To maximize the utilities of national firearms focal points, some lifecycle management systems in Europe offer direct integration of the registry to the national firearms focal points link analysis software via, for example, application programming interfaces. And these aid investigation, tracing, and analysis. But crucially, it's important for such systems to first fulfill the basics of lifecycle management for NFFPs to truly be effective and efficient in their performing their duties. Thank you very much for my presentation. I appreciate that was a very whistle-stop tour just to try and keep to time. So if you have any questions, please just put them in the Q&A and we'll do our best to answer them later. Additionally, you can also access me on callum.lloyd@archibus.eu. I'm more than happy to discuss this further. And I'll also make sure that the slides and their content is sent to the team at the Forum on the Arms Trade so they can share this with you after the session. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Callum, for your very extensive presentation, especially your insights on life cycle management of small arms light weapons. I really enjoyed the diagram, which kind of helps us visualize the movement of these weapons, but also the challenges with technology, framework, data, and resources that you outlined were very helpful. With that, I would now like to move on to our third speaker, Natalia, who will be providing the Latin American perspectives on this topic. Thank you, Natalia, for joining us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Mona Lisa. It's a pleasure to be here with you all. I will also share a presentation. So just 1 second. And here it is. Okay. Yeah, so I also would like to start to mentioning this more in a zoom out vision of the connections between the legal market and the illegal market. Because sometimes when you talk about marking, tracing, and record keeping, sometimes people think just on one of those boxes. And I think it's interesting to look at them as two sides of the same problem or two sides of the same coin, understanding that the legal market and the illegal market are intrinsically connected or tangled. And despite we have now the challenge of the privately made firearms, some of them entirely made from scratch in workshops or illegal factories. Even though we still have the large majority of the firearms coming from the legal market and somehow, and in some point of their life cycle, being diverted to the illegal market. And here I highlight some points that might be interesting intervention points when we think about improving marking and tracing processes. And in a more in-depth look at each one of them, when we look at the legal market, one of the important items, as Ashley was mentioning, are the marking requirements. So which information are required to be marked? For example, in Brazil, we require to be marked the manufacturer, the firearm model, the caliber, the country of production, and the serial number. We also might think about the quantity of those markings. For example, in Brazil, each one of those markings is required to be just once in the firearm, but the serial number, as it's much more strategic, is required to be marked in 3 different parts of the firearm. Also, location is something that we can discuss. For example, those 3 markings of serial numbers that are required in Brazilian legislation, they are placed in some specific locations of the firearm with the intention of making them harder to be suppressed. So some locations would require the person to disassemble the firearm, suppress, and assemble again. So that's an important barrier trying to lower the possibility of those markings suppression. The technique that is used, so if it's a laser marking and mechanical engraving, and even now we have different technologies being discussed, such as the use of chips, of chemical tags, and things like that. And another important thing to consider is the impact of the marking in the production lines. And here, I think we need to try finding, the sweet spot where we can require all the markings that are necessary for our tracing process. And of course, our point of view is that the public security is a priority when we think about that. But there is also this question of the production lines adaptation regarding how this can be actually enforced or actually executed by the industry. So something that we need to take into consideration is to do not make constant changes or too fast-paced changes in the marking requirements, or to when we make a change or a new requirement to have an adaptation period. For example, the industry has 6 months or 1 year to adapt its production lines, because that's not something necessarily already given in their technology. And here, of course, I think the public sector and civil society and academia have a really important role pushing for innovation, because when we see many of the industries public notes or how they position themselves, rarely they will in a voluntary way invest in those innovations on marking which are not directly related with their profit. So here I think the public sector, academia, and civil society have this really important role into pushing for innovation, but of course being considerate with what is feasible. The marking execution, so of course there's the need of oversight of the manufacturers and importers if they are complying with the requirements, and there are also voluntary good practices. So for example, there are some industries that beyond marking the serial numbers, they also embed information within the serial number sequence of digits. So that's a good practice that could be could receive more incentives, or can even move to the first position and become a marking requirement. So there is also this opportunity to look at voluntary good practices from different manufacturers or different countries, different regions, looking, for example, what is different on requirements from Latin America comparing with Europe and things like that. And the legal register and record keeping, as we were mentioning, so there is this requirement and the importance of having good registers and record keeping for public and for private arsenals. So here we can discuss which information is collected, how it is available to which institutions. So for example, in Brazil, we have 2 institutions responsible for national gun control policies, the Army and the Federal Police, and the database of the Federal Police is available for state-level policies, but the Army's database isn't. So if a state-level police wants to consult the Federal Police database, they can do that directly, but if they want to consult the Army's database, they need to make a formal request, wait a few days for a formal answer. So how these databases are accessible also matters, and how they are built. I mean, if they are built in a really outdated format, or if they are built in a way that makes the data available for intelligence analysis, real-time updates, for massive consults, so that you don't need to consult each serial number individually. You can put on a group of serial numbers and consult them as a group. So all those elements may impact on the result. And when we looked at the legal market side, so when the arm is already seized or recovered, what we see here are those main intervention points. So there's a first register that is made of this firearm usually in the police officer unit. So in the first unit that seized this firearm, that's a first and fastest record, but it's not a specialized one. So many times this police officer isn't so familiar with the specificities of the firearms, and he can take note of a wrong caliber, or he can misspell the firearm brand, or he can identify a carbine as an assault rifle. He can, makes those confusions. So usually this is a database that's faster to be built, and is also integrated with the information on the seizure dynamic, which is really important. So if we want to understand, for example, in which dynamics assault rifles are being seized, or in which dynamics this specific brand is appearing, this integration with the data on the seizure operation is really important. The next step would be the seized arms forensics report. So usually they go to the forensics teams, where they will do here the technically correct and verified identification of this arm. So here is, the goal of the information quality. But many times, usually this takes longer. It can vary a lot between countries and even regions, how much time 1 week or 3 months. And many times this information is not organized in a database format, or it's not integrated with the information on the seizure. So it has, the goal regarding quality, but it also has some difficulties. And regarding the tracing, that's also important regarding which databases are available. So for example, in Brazil, if they can access the 2 main databases or just one of them, if they can access, for example, the ATF, the A-Trace now ATF system, if they can access Interpol, if they can get in contact with the bordering countries or not. So this institutional cooperation, both national and foreign, is really important. Many times what we see is a lack of specialization of the police officers that are doing this tracing. So many times they are not allocated in this activity long enough to be specialized and to understand which arms demand more attention, or if this brand is an outlier regarding what we usually see in our market. So sometimes there is also this lack of specialization makes the process no longer or less effective, and also the lack of priority. So here in Brazil, that's really common, and many times the police officers, they are more concerned, or they receive as a guidance to prioritize the investigation of the robbery, of the homicide, of the main criminal dynamic, for so saying, and they don't have the time, they don't have the resources to also dedicate themselves to find the origin of this firearm. So many times they are seized and it's stocked in a stockpile and it's sort of forgotten there, and don't receive this prioritization to the whole tracing process. And the same applies to the legal process. Many times the last legal owner is identified, but the legal process has no time and no priority to give continuity to this process, and actually makes this person or this company responsible for diverting this firearm, or even to understand if the company was the victim of a robbery or something like that. And here also we talk a little bit more about common challenges. So there is this understanding as a strategic investment, as I was mentioning many times, that isn't the case, and people don't understand that looking at the firearms origin is a strategic investment to reduce several types of crimes. And usually the most serious crimes is organized crime, territorial domain, homicides, even internal armed conflicts and things like that. So it would be really important to spread this awareness that this is a strategic investment that has impact in several criminal dynamics at the same time. There's a specialization to perceive trends, outliers, which things are more probable to obtain a result in the short time or not. And in this case, Firearms works with several police units trying to help them into this specialization. And we are also encouraging state-level policies to create specialized units dedicated exclusively to fighting arms trafficking in Brazil. We already have 6 of them. And it's been an interesting experience to follow their constant evolution. The time of reaction versus the legal market adaptability. So what we see many times is that the public institutions have a longer time of reaction, even in the small things, as to adapt a database field to be, to note one additional information, for example, on privately made firearms. Or to understand that now there is a new dynamic, a new brand appearing. Who do I contact to have more information about this brand or about this serial number that has a different pattern? Who do I contact with? And the illegal market adapts really quickly. So we have this difference of pace in adaptation.
Sorry, Natalia,
Sure.
you're reaching your time limit.
Okay, really wrapping up. So national and foreign cooperation, as we all know, it's a challenge, and counterfeit markings is something that I wanted to mention. As you see here in the photos in the right side, we have many cases of counterfeit markings that can mislead, especially this initial record at the police unit. We have marks that when we are used to the theme, we can easily see that they are counterfeit, for example, made with ink or even with typos, but we are seeing the increase, really rapid increase in their quality. For example, some of them have digital files that mimic the real markings made by the industry. So that's a growing challenge and makes it even more important that we try to access the data from the forensics analysis and not only the data from the police unit. And finally, on opportunities, of course, we also have several opportunities regarding tech evolution, database and inventory, processes and resources, BI, AI, programming, of course, if verified, the ballistic comparison systems, and even in marking technologies, we are now much more able to mark, for example, internal parts, to have mechanical engrave with greater depth, to mark small ammunition individually, nano markings, laser, chemical tags, so on. So at the same time that we do have important challenges, we also have some really interesting opportunities to explore. That's it. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Natalia, for sharing the differences of marking requirements across both legal and illegal markets, and how academia, civil society, and other relevant stakeholders can contribute and advocate for innovations. I would now like to move on to our final speaker of the day, who has been waiting very patiently. Sylvia, thank you so much for joining us. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for the invitation to this panel, and to the previous speakers for making my job easier now, because you've been speaking on the tracing systems, on record keeping, as well as the kind of information that should be reflected in the markings. And I'm going to focus on the physically marking technique in particular. And I'm going to be speaking on behalf, while I try to share my screen, I'm going to be speaking on behalf of the UN Regional Center for Peace, Disarmament, and Development in Latin America and the Caribbean. Yunlirek, can you see my screen now?
Yeah, that's good.
Thank you. Our name, Yunlirek, that we are the regional branch of the UN Office for Disarmament Affairs, working in the Latin American and Caribbean region, providing technical assistance to states in the region related to arms control and countering firearms trafficking. Well, beyond being a legal obligation, marking serves for some core purposes. As we've been seeing in the previous presentations, it enables the unique identification of each firearm, it supports the reliable record keeping, and it also allows the tracing when a firearm is diverted and later on seized. And I'm going to focus on the laser marking of firearms. I'm going to be sharing the findings of a research that we at UNLIREC conducted last year, that we conducted in order to better understand the limitations and opportunities that this relatively new technology offers for firearms marking. Because we've received in the region a lot of requests of advice from different governments on which kind of technology for firearms marking is the most adequate for their needs. So I will be sharing in the chat the link to this presentation so you can read more in detail what we researched. And we have also in the room my colleague Ruben Arancibia, who is a forensic expert that participated in this research. So for the Q&A session, I'm sure that he will be very happy to provide some more technical insights if needed. So well, as I was saying, or it's been said in previous presentations, international instruments require firearms to be marked at the moment of manufacture, at the moment of import, and in other certain circumstances, like it could be when firearms, stockpile firearms, national firearms from the national stockpiles are transferred to civilian use and other circumstances. So, but what the instruments do not reflect is the marking method that should be applied. This is left for the choice of each state. But there are certain international standards or best practices that are emphasized, and these markings should be conspicuous and readable. They should be durable, and as far as technically possible, they should be recoverable if they are obliterated. And that last element, the recoverability, is where technological choices become critical, especially these new technologies like like laser marking. Traditionally, stamping has been the most widely used marking method. We've also seen some images at the beginning from our CAR colleague of some markings from ECOWAS. I think it was .pin, which is another different marking technology, but it's also applied through pressure rather than in one single press. It's like a small pressure points, making the line of the numbers or logos that we are marking. However, as I was saying, there are other technologies like laser marking that are gaining, if not relevance, at least interest in many of the manufacturers and countries. The positive thing of pressure markings like stamping is that it creates a plastic deformation of the metal that is being marked. And even if we obliterate the markings afterwards, this plastic deformation remains even if it's not clearly visible. So with certain forensic methods, we could recover the markings. In the case of laser engraving, that we are slowly transitioning to that, this has been a major concern. It does offer several advantages like high precision, which is very important as well when we are looking at the small markings on the firearms. It is adaptable to different materials, not only metals, but also polymers, which can help within newly manufactured firearms that also include this type of material in some of their parts and components. Even although it is recommended that the markings are applied on metals, there are some additional markings that could be applied on the polymers, and in the case of laser, we can undo so without damaging the material or the functioning of the weapon itself. In relation to that, a laser also allows marking without contacting the surface. We will see in a moment how the laser is applied. So this could be particularly useful, for example, for marking firearms that have already been assembled and it is not so easy to reach certain parts of the weapon where we want to apply the markings. Also to reach certain surfaces that otherwise it would be difficult to reach as well. It also allows for fast processing time, as my co-panelist from Sodapas was mentioning earlier. This is also an important point for the manufacturing processes. The ability to include logos or barcodes or complex alphanumeric formats, that is not the traditional markings, but it could also amplify or like include additional information to identify the weapon. And it is cost effective per unit once the machine has already been installed. The initial reimbursement is quite expensive. So as it was being mentioned, for states that are trying to modernize their production lines or to apply the import marking in firearms that are already assembled, laser systems seem to be quite attractive. But it also raised the question that it was mentioned before. Does laser engraving meet the standard of recoverability? So for that, we have to understand a little bit better how laser engraving works. I won't get too much into the detail because I'm aware of the time, but as we can see here, laser engraving works by removing material through the heat that is emitted by the laser head. So a beam of light, of highly concentrated light, reaches the surface that we want to mark. It reaches very high temperatures. We are talking about thousands of degrees Celsius. And when it reaches the surface of the material that we are marking, it gets so hot that the material evaporates in a process that is called sublimation. So it doesn't melt the material, it evaporates or removes the material through this process of sublimation. And this is what leaves a groove, what we can see in the screen. And here on the left, you can see how the groove looks when the real metal plate is being marked. We took certain images with a microscope to be able to better understand the groove that it leaves and the way that it affects the material. As you can see, unlike stamping, which works by by applying pressure on the surface that we are marking and leaves plastic deformation on the surface. Laser engraving what does is removing the material, and it creates comparatively a very thin affected zone underneath the groove, which makes the retracing, or the restoration of the obliterated markings more difficult. This distinction, as I was saying, really matters. We can see it's a way of trying to reflect what we are referring to. If deliberately someone tries to obliterate the markings, either criminals or, in our case, scientists in our laboratories, we can be able to obliterate the marking to the level that the marking itself is not visible, but it could be restored through certain restoration techniques, like I will explain later on. But it's not the same to be able to recover all of these layers that could be visible or alterated than one, as we can see with laser, that is thinner and not so not plastically deformed. So given this concern, us at Unirec wanted to conduct several experiments to understand what is actually the capacity to restore these laser marked laser engraved markings. And we conducted throughout several months more than 100 tests over plates that were made of specific alloys of metals that are used for the key components of firearms by the industry. That included specific alloys, stainless steel, mild steel, aluminum, and we also tried on a Glock polymer. And our tests included a first phase that it was the kind of marking, like the parameters that we would like to apply in the laser machine to mark the firearms to the sufficient depth for its restoration. And then a second part of the test in restoring the obliterated markings afterwards. For the laser marking part of our experiment, we were playing
Sorry,
with. Yes?
sorry, Sylvia. You need to wrap up. It's a 10-minute mark. Sorry.
Okay, no, thank you for letting me know. I will be very quick. I just wanted to explain this, the process of the experiment that we were conducting, and to better understand afterwards the results that we had. As we can see here, we were able to restore in the second image. It might not be very clear in a small screen, but we were able to restore markings that we had obliterated and we had previously engraved with our laser marking machine. So here you can see a screenshot of all of the experiments or all the tests that we conducted. And from that, we extracted some key conclusions and recommendations that could be applied for those working in this field. So among the considerations that should be taken into account when choosing whether we use laser marking for engraving firearms, it's important to take into account which materials we would be marking. In the case of polymers, it might be more effective than other pressure methods like stamping that could damage the functionality of the component. When marking assembled firearms, it is also easier, as I was saying earlier, because of not being in contact with the surface. It also helps to access to minuscule or hidden areas. And I think my colleague Polaki had mentioned earlier the good practice of including security markings, like maybe the last numbers of the serial number in other parts of the weapon, not the essential components. That would also help the identification and tracing of it, especially if it's trafficked disassembled. And it also help the precision and in the markings that we apply in case that we want to apply additional symbols, like we were seeing earlier in the case of ECOWAS. But some of the concerns that we have is the cost of the equipment. We are talking about around 40,000 US dollars. So for many countries, especially in this region, has been a concern. And it also includes some operative costs like the energy consumption, etc., and the training of the operators applying the markings with it. I will very quickly mention some final conclusions or recommendations that emerge from our research. If laser engraving is used on essential metal components, what the findings of our research shed light on is that the depth should be at least 0.2 millimeters depth. Any markings that were less than that were not consistently recovered. Import markings, where possible, should respect the minimum depth standards. And where polymers frames are involved, marking should preferably be applied to embedded metal plates in line with Mosaic, that will be shared in the chat afterwards as well. And states should ensure coordination between manufacturers, licensing authorities, and forensic laboratories in all of this process. And finally, as a close-up, further research is still needed. After our research, we want to include additional markings with additional laser types and other forensic techniques to restore the firearms and try with different depths as well in order to strengthen the evidence base for all of our recommendations. So with that, I'll stop there and stay ready for our Q&A session. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Sylvia, for sharing the technical insights on the various physical marking practices and also the challenges of recovery. Sorry, we have to cut it short because we are running short on time and we need to get to the Q&A because I believe we have quite a few questions lined up for our panelists. And with that, I would now like to open the floor to any questions from the audience. Please use the Q&A feature to submit your questions and we'll address as many as time permits. We have a few lined up, which I invite our speakers to look at. I guess we can go with the first one from Ibrahim. He's asking, is there any established tracking system currently used in Somalia? And if so, could you kindly indicate how it is procured or sourced? If anybody would like to jump in. Yes, please go ahead, Ashley.
And if the panelists, sorry, before you go, Ashley, panelists, please turn on your videos at this point.
Yes. Okay, there we go. Got it. Am I there? Yes. Hi, everybody. Thank you for the question from Abdirashid. I will say I work in West Africa, not on our Somalia team. But I do know that that CAR has been involved in introducing an inventory management system with the Somali federal government, which is a inventory management and record keeping of conventional weapons, specifically under national ownership and control. It's called ARMAS, the Arms Registration and Management System, and we pioneered it in Somalia in cooperation with the federal government. My understanding is that it has more or less been handed over at this point to the federal government, and it's basically a secure digital inventory management system which enables governments and security forces to register their stockpile of weapons and ammunition and track them through through the life cycle. It's my understanding is that it's deployable at large scale. It's easy to train security forces to use it. And it requires cell phones critically, so it's great for resource limited environments where connectivity is a challenge, and it can be used offline. I think it's been tremendously successful for inventory management and in keeping an eye on exactly where weapons and ammunition are deployed to, where their location is, and then registering the moment when diversion is recorded or becomes apparent. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Um, we have a question from Bruno, which I think everyone will be able to answer. What are the good experiences in the harmonization of firearms data, caliber, brands, model types to facilitate cooperation, information sharing, and tracing among regions? Or are there any strong technical materials on the subject? Callum, please go ahead.
Thanks, Mona Lisa, and thanks, Bruno, for the question. So I think in response, the there are a number of different systems of standardization for referring to the unique identifying or the classification data rather of firearms and essential components. Particularly, some of those include the Interpol International Firearms Reference Table, which is based on the Royal Canadian Mounted Police's Firearms Reference Table. This is the one that's used by Firecycle, and it's also used by a variety of different jurisdictions throughout Europe and globally. There are other examples of custom reference systems, and those exist for a variety of different reasons. For example, the Germans and the Dutch use a system called Ex-Waffe, which is a specific format that's suited to the federal technology structure that Germany uses. It allows interoperability between systems that use different programming languages. And it also is quite innovative in the sense that it actually records synonymous makes and models and synonymous calibers. So rather than have a single reference system for calibers, like, for example, the Interpol Firearms Reference Table does, where for example, 9mm by 19 is just recorded as 9mm Luger. Instead, the Ex-Waffe system will recognize synonymous calibers and see that when it's interacting with other systems that use the same format. So really, there's no standard worldwide is the answer, though there's plenty of writing and evidence of or instances of good practices that have been recorded. The Small Arms Survey in particular has done quite a lot of work related to this, and there are actually outcome documents from Project Regisync that look at effective and innovative practices with standardization of data, and also then the international exchange of that data. What I'll do is I make sure that the team have a couple of links to our website where we host some PDF copies of the research documents for you to look through. And of course, feel free to email me at any stage if you want to have a further conversation. I can point to other areas of good practice.
Thanks, Callum. Another, I believe, interesting question is from Arthur, who's asking, are there efforts or projects on any jurisdiction to make data on seized firearms and components, including serial numbers and other markings, publicly available, as this would be super helpful for civil society actors?
Yeah, it's a great question. If it's okay, I'll answer this one again, as Project Vista is currently
Go ahead.
looking at 35 jurisdictions in Europe and how they go about recording and analyzing firearm seizure data. I think although it would be excellent for firearms seizure data to be shared in this way, the reality is that the data often isn't recorded in any centralized way within jurisdictions, even in very advanced small arms control contexts like the European Union and the Western Balkans. The Western Balkans actually are probably one of the leaders in this respect. UNDP has done some excellent work in establishing standardized and centralized approaches to recording firearms seizure data. We have to remember that when firearms seizures occur, they can occur from a variety of different agencies. I'm sure Ashley could probably speak to this too in her experience, that a firearm could be seized by the national police, they could be seized by regional police, by military authorities, or potentially even borders and customs. And sometimes what's confusing is that a borders and customs seizure could occur in country, whereas a national police seizure could occur at the border. We can't necessarily infer the point of seizure from the agency that conducted the seizure. Often these different agencies can sit under different ministries. That means that depending on the jurisdiction, some of that data is not necessarily shared between agencies. The result of that, the so what, is that it means at the national level, it's often quite difficult for many jurisdictions to actually give you a concrete answer on what they've seized, how many there are within a given period, and even what those makes and models, calibers, etc., are, the circumstances that they were seized in, and the type of seizures that they relate to, whether they're criminal or administrative. I think just to round off that point is that there's also some concerns about the security of that data and the protection of that data. Particularly, we see in Europe, for example, there are some jurisdictions, and the jury's not necessarily out yet on whether a serial number constitutes personally identifying information, and so they can't necessarily be shared publicly. We see that particularly in Europe, where unless they're in very specific law enforcement context where the data exchange is permitted under GDPR, there are issues with releasing a serial number to the public, because in theory that serial number could then be used to find out who a licensed owner of that firearm once was at some stage in its life cycle. I hope that explains why it's a little bit more, although it would be excellent if it could occur, there are numerous different reasons why, unfortunately, there isn't such a system or source of data at the present moment in time.
Thank you, Callum. Natalia and Ashley has a hand up. If you have any quick insights on this, please go ahead. Natalia, you first.
Yeah, thank you. Also sharing about this database availability. We also face some difficulties to obtain this level of detail. Sometimes we do find this wall of having as an answer that this is considered a personal information and they couldn't share. But in some cases, we were able to access serial number of seized firearms. With the past, that regularly researches on the profiles of the seized firearms. We just launched one last year that is available in the Journal of Illicit Economies and Development. I'll post the link in the chat, where we were able to analyze both the profile and the serial numbers of some seized arms in a region of Brazil, not the entire country. But even when we access those databases, there's a lot of work to harmonize, as Bruno mentioned in the comments, to harmonize this data set, to conduct consistency checks, for example, to see if the caliber fits the type of the firearm that is described and things like that. But in this case of this last publication, we were also able to make part of the data sets available online. So we are adopting this open data sharing policy. So I also encourage you to check on these databases and also encourage other civil society organizations and the academia. If we can share those databases among us, I think we can find interesting links, for example, where the Brazilian arms are coming from, where the arms from Somalia are coming from. I think we also can create our network of information sharing. Thank you.
Thank you, Natalia. Ashley, please go ahead.
Yes, just to quickly add that particularly in the West Africa context, where you're dealing with a huge terrorism open conflict situation, the authorities, understandably, are often unable to share data, particularly for active investigations, recent investigations, or unresolved investigations, and it's not possible to share certain elements of the data regarding firearms seizures. That said, again, there are organizations, as have been discussed, including ours, that do publish on data, including serial numbers for weapons, often large numbers of data sets that have been cleared and are accessible publicly to be referred to. Yes, that's all. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Sylvia, please go ahead.
Thank you so much. I wanted to share two experiences coming from the Caribbean region. In particular, I've been working the last few years with Haiti, and here the national authorities face a lot of challenges to trace the firearms because of the lack of comprehensive national registries of firearms and also the capacities of their investigative police also to trace the firearms that have entered illegally into the country. So we have the experience of the UN panel of experts on Haiti designated by the UN Security Council, and they trace on a regular basis firearms that are reported as seized in the country in cooperation with the national authorities. And to face some of these challenges of not having the information, not only the serial numbers are the way of tracing the firearms, but also the models and trying to link them with other type of crimes that these type of weapons may have been identified in the region. And with that, we can maybe find some trends or routes that are linking the country with other countries in the region and the illicit flows of firearms. And the cooperation with the national authorities from other countries is very important as well, including serial numbers and other specific data on the firearms. It's not easy to obtain from the national authorities, but maybe at a more trend-based, it is working very well. And you can access to their regular reports that are submitted to the UN Security Council and made public. So it's a way for everyone interested in this kind of or this specific context to access information at the statistical or route-based level on the firearms trafficking affecting Haiti and neighbors. And the other good practice, even if it's again not database of seized firearms or components in the Caribbean region, is the Caribbean Crime Gun Intelligence Units that CARICOM countries have created. Again, Caribbean countries are very small and the resources are very limited. So the idea of integrating their capacities in one CARICOM-based unit where all the tracing efforts can be optimized and like they can share information in that framework confidentially is also helping. It's been only operative for 2 years, so it's early to assess its impact, but it's also a good experience that I wanted to highlight of how the Caribbean countries and smaller are also sharing information and contributing to the investigation of illicit firearms trafficking.
Thank you, Sylvia. One last question, and I, of course, request all our panelists to keep their answers short, unfortunately, in the interest of time. The question is from Hein Chanda, who's asking some around ammunition. Since we have all these technology that we are currently developing to make it to make it easier to trace these weapons, where do the illegal users get their ammunition from? Maybe if anybody would like to take. Sure. Ashley, please go ahead.
I'll say, first of all, if we're talking about ammunition, ammunition is notoriously difficult to mark and to trace. First of all, I mean, if we're talking about small caliber ammunition, as you all know, there's very little space to put detailed markings on individual cartridges. There are lots of different movements in motion to improve the traceability of ammunition, not least the adoption, rollout of the global framework on ammunition, which is in process at the moment and is very exciting and is specifically designed for states to start meeting obligations to improve the traceability of ammunition, not only states, but the emphasis is also on manufacturers to be at the forefront of improving ammunition traceability. In terms of specifically the West Africa context for where illicit ammunition is obtained, again, you're talking about a big open conflict and terrorism situation. The vast majority of ammunition that we have documented, small caliber ammunition that we've documented across West Africa in the last decade, originates in the stockpiles of the states that are fighting the terrorism problem. and it is largely battlefield captures and diversion from state stockpiles, which is understandable to a degree, inevitable in an open conflict setting. But there is huge importance in improving the traceability of ammunition in order to attempt to reduce the likelihood of it being diverted. Thank you.
Thank you, Ashley. Sylvia, please go ahead.
Thank you. In the Caribbean, again, in Dominican Republic, we are seeing the good practice. Now, their legislation includes the marking of ammunition. Of course, it cannot be as comprehensive because of the space that we have as the information that could be marked on firearms, but it may include the country, RD, República Dominicana, and the year of importation. So this could also help the tracing of ammunition that has been imported in Dominican Republic and that might be related to the country at some point. And it is not best practice from this region, from Latin America and the Caribbean, but we are also aware that in Somalia they were starting to apply chemical marking on ammunitions. I think it's a project that started last year, so it's early again to assess its impact, but I think it's also something very interesting to keep monitoring in the coming or in the near future to see how it works and whether other countries would like to replicate that best practice.
Thank you, Sylvia. Callum, please go ahead.
Thanks, Mona Lisa. Just to add on to some of the comments from the colleagues, just to provide the European perspective in relation to this question. In Europe, of course, there's the background of the former Yugoslavia, the dissolution of Yugoslavia, and the legacy war stocks, stockpiles and surplus that has proliferated and diverted from those stockpiles. In addition to that, in the European context, where control is more rigorous, criminals are increasingly more ingenious about how they acquire ammunition. Often that's through legal loopholes and exploiting loopholes in other jurisdictions and then traversing borders and trafficking that ammunition. Also, we see instances quite commonly of modified ammunition, so often 9mm pack, so blank ammunition will be converted to fire a lethal projectile. Often that's a ball bearing, for example. And we also see more increasingly instances of 3D printed ammunition and illicitly manufactured ammunition that is normally manufactured from acquired components of ammunition via just using a reloading bench. It's very common for sport shooters and hunters to reload ammunition or to manufacture their own ammunition, particularly in sport shooting, where accuracy is really important. That's what we typically see in the European context, at least when it comes to the illicit use and acquisition of ammunition.
Thank you, Callum. And with that, we are coming an end to today's session. And as we conclude today's webinar, I would first like to extend our sincere gratitude to all our panelists for sharing their expertise and to all our participants for your active engagement. Also, many thanks to the Small Arms and Light Weapons Working Group members for all your work in organizing this event, and Jeff for always supporting our ideas. We would like to inform our participants that after you exit today's webinar, you will receive a short survey, and we would really appreciate if you could take a very quick minute to share any feedback or suggestion that you may have on this event or for future events. We will also be following up with an event report, resources that were shared during today's call, and a recording of today's session, which will be made available on the forum's website, across our social media channels, and circulated throughout our newsletter. So please keep an eye out for that. And that's all from me today. Thank you so much for coming, and have a wonderful rest of your day. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much to everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so
It
much.
was a pleasure.
Bye.
Thanks,
Bye.
everybody.
Thank you. Thank you.